Hey, what's up everyone? The new MSI Claw 8 AI Plus with the Core Ultra 7 258V and the Intel Arc 140V iGPU has been released not long ago, and for this video I've tested 20 games on it using both the fastest 30W and the medium 17W profiles, which will probably be what most people would want to use on the go for the best mix of battery life and performance, as the 8W profile will be only suitable for really light gaming and some retro emulation. For the test setup, the MSI Claw was plugged in all the time via an external USB hub, to which I've also connected a mouse and a keyboard, as well as an external M.2 NVMe SSD to store some of the games. While the MSI Claw's display is a 1920 by 1200 display, I actually recorded the games at a slightly lower 1080p because otherwise I sometimes would get problems with my external capture card choosing the right aspect ratio. So in reality you will probably need to either reduce the gain FPS by 2 to 3% or alternatively use a resolution of 1680 by 10050 for a slight uplift in performance for your MSI Claw. I could have, of course, just showed you numbers at 1200p instead, but as usual I prefer showing real gameplay to you so you can get a better feel for the frame times and the graphics. In my video where I compare the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus to the ROG Ally, the German YouTube channel SteamDad mentioned in the comment below that in Wukong Black Myth the Claw actually performs better on the 17W profile when it's unplugged and on battery. So there obviously are still some bugs present as of today, which might be improved with future BIOS updates by MSI or Intel driver updates. And I can't rule out that that wouldn't happen in other games, as recording while it's unplugged is quite annoying for many reasons. So please keep in mind that since this handheld is brand new, there can and will be issues and bugs in general. If you're watching this video a few weeks or even month after its release, the performance could be better in many of today's tested games. And an important note, since MSI is not sending me review samples and just ignoring my emails, I had to get the Claw 8 AI Plus for myself with my own money, and because I plan to keep it longer than the return window for future tests, I would really appreciate your help in return by simply clicking the like button for this video or maybe even subscribe to the channel. That helps a lot, thank you. Also, making these videos takes forever, so... However, the games will be presented in alphabetical order, while I will start showing the 30W results in each game, then the 17W results with identical settings, and then we will switch to the next game, and so on. And now, without further ado, let's have a look at the benchmarks. The first game for today will be Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, using the 30W profile, for which I was forced to set the resolution to 720p with the lowest settings and FSR set to performance to get a halfway playable experience. 39 FPS on average, with 1% loss of 25 after 5 minutes of walking around. I mean, it is doable overall, but far from optimal, as you can see. The frame time graph sometimes is mostly flat, and in some areas it's getting a bit wild, and of course the game is getting kinda blurry that way. Well, to be honest, it still looks kinda good due to all that vegetation and stuff. Using the 17W profile with the same settings, the average FPS dropped to 31 FPS and the 1% loss to 20. Now sometimes the FPS even dropped to as low as 25 FPS, though it was mostly at 30 or above. I mean, I have to admit, the game still looks pretty good, even with these low settings, but even if you're very hardcore, that is considered barely playable by many of you, I assume. For Alan Wake 2, I was using 1080p with FSR on balanced, combined with low settings, which gave me 38 FPS on average with the 30W profile, and the 1% lows have been around 23, running around the town for 8 minutes after the first chapter. As soon as more vegetation was on the screen, the FPS dropped to around 30. Now with the 17W profile, these settings led to an unplayable experience, in this case with around 26 FPS on average and 1% loss of only 12, while the frame rate was climbing and falling like on a roller coaster with like between 17 up to 36 FPS. So I'm kinda assuming an issue with the drivers or the Claw's power optimization in general. Probably fixable in the future, considering it's brand new as of the making of this video. Next up was Apex Legends at 1080p with the lowest settings, but the VRAM streaming on high. which equals 4 GB. Using the 30 watt profile, that resulted in very stable and well playable 109 FPS on average and decent 1% lows of 70 FPS. A good experience, very smooth despite the displayed CPU usage of 100%. And even with the 17 watt profile, the game managed to remain playable, though with now only 76 FPS on average and 1% lows of 45. A few micro stutters here and there, and the frame time graph wasn't as smooth anymore, though overall still doable, I guess. Now, Ark Survival Evolved is probably my least favorite game to test, as I don't play it myself and I really don't know what to do. But using the 30 watt profile at 1080p with medium settings and a resolution scaling of 75%, the game really looks blurry even on that 8-inch screen, while the average FPS were actually okay with around 57 FPS, though the frame time graph looked like a hedgehog and the 1% lows were around 31 FPS. But it felt a bit more fluid than what the numbers suggest. Using the same settings at 17 watt resulted in now 40 FPS on average, with 1% lows of only 16. Some noticeable stuttering and a very unhealthy looking frame time graph now definitely made it less enjoyable. Though, as the CPU usage seems to be fine, further lowering the settings and using an FPS cap could be an option here. I was also testing the brand new RPG Avowed at 1080p using the medium preset, which uses FSR on performance. That resulted in 39 FPS for playing the epilogue for around 20 minutes, with 1% lows of around 27 FPS, and it was playable overall, though once in the city, the FPS took a noticeable hit to around 29 FPS on average and a frequent micro stuttering, leading to a horrible 1% low of only 5 FPS. Reducing the quality to low did help a bit with the average FPS, but I still experienced some stuttering and micro freezes, unfortunately. Might be because both the Claw 8 and the game are brand new and not yet optimized. Using the 17 watt profile instead, the average FPS was now around 33 for the rest of the epilogue, with some stuttering that resulted in 1% lows of only 17. But using that profile while walking around in the city was almost unbearable, with severe frame drops below 20 FPS and a very high CPU usage. Also in general, FSR on performance is causing some very noticeable noise considering the image quality. For Baldurs Gate 3 I was using the medium preset at 1080p with FSR 2 set to quality, walking around for 7 minutes in Act 3. While the average FPS have been okay with around 38 FPS, the 1% lows were damaged by frequent micro freezes and slight stuttering, resulting in only around 11 FPS. While it doesn't affect the gameplay for this title, as it's round-based, it's surely degrading the fun overall. CPU usage was high, though not at 100%, so again, probably best to use an FPS cap of 30 here. Now with the 17 watt profile and the same settings, there was an expected drop in the average and 1% low FPS, 29 and 8 FPS. So for this, I would highly suggest using lower settings and maybe even drop the resolution a bit further. Again, as this is a round-based game, you could surely finish the game like that without any gameplay issues, though it could be considered a bit annoying in this state. Next up is Call of Duty Black Ops 6, for which I was testing the multiplayer part on the Nuketown map at 1080p with the basic graphics preset with XCSS on balanced mode. At 30 watt, that resulted in 68 FPS on average and 1% lows of 48. It's doable, while there have been occasional micro stutters over the whole span of the match. Dropping the wattage to the 17 watt profile resulted in a much higher CPU usage, and now only 53 FPS on average with 1% lows of 22 FPS, and some wild frame time graph irritations caused by frame drops. Probably kinda okay for some casual fun, but I wouldn't recommend playing it on a regular basis that way, to be honest. There's just too much of a disadvantage using that profile at the moment. Cyberpunk 2077 is actually working pretty well using the 30W profile at medium settings with XeSS on performance, while the game looks absolutely fine that way, in my opinion, especially on that small 8-inch screen, and even on a 1080p screen, a regular monitor, if you're not too picky about some blur. 53 FPS on average with 1% lows of 39, and even driving around in crowded areas of Night City didn't cause any major issues. The CPU usage was high once again, but had some headroom left. Though, using the 17W profile, the CPU usage once more was close to 100%. The average FPS now dropped to 38 FPS and the 1% lows were at 23 FPS. In general, that sounds still doable, but I've experienced some heavy rubber banding, meaning the gameplay slowed down a bit and then accelerated on a constant basis. Unfortunately for me, that makes it kinda unplayable, as it feels like you're really held back, by a rubber band. That didn't happen all the time and in all scenes, but it happened a lot and really destroys the fun here. And you should be able to see that in the recorded footage if you take a closer look. For CS2, I was using 1080p with the low preset with FSR unbalanced, which resulted in around 113 FPS on average and 1% lows of 75. While it's playable that way, I expected more, to be honest. Hopefully resolvable with future driver updates. A sentence we often hear when gaming on Intel iGPUs actually. Though, the game is still playable using the 17W profile that way with around 89 FPS on average and 1% lows of 48. And in both cases, the frametime graph was actually pretty flat, so I mean, it could be better, but it is still playable just fine, I guess. Using the 30W profile at Elden Ring with a resolution of 1080p and the low preset, I saw an average of around 54 FPS and 1% lows of 41, and the game is absolutely playable that way, and on an 8-inch screen, the blurriness of the vegetation isn't actually that bad. And switching to the 17W profile with the same settings, I now saw an average of 39 FPS with 1% lows of 28, which is still absolutely playable, though with a bit more input lag and a less direct feel to it, of course. But well, considering Dark Souls 1 ran with 30 FPS locked when it was released, I guess it is somewhat okay since there haven't been any noteworthy stuttering. Now, Enshrouded forced me to really reduce the graphics settings. The MSI Afterburner OSD isn't working anymore in this game, so I can't give you any average or 1% lows. With a resolution of only 720p and using the performance preset with FSR on performance, the game is kinda a blurry mess and still only runs with around 27 to 40 FPS most of the time. I mean, it is playable, but it doesn't look good, and you can even see the blurry edges on the small screen. At least with the 17W profile, the experience wasn't a lot worse with around 24 to 37 FPS, so it's probably still playable, while I would think twice about actually playing the game in this state on this device, to be honest. Though, since this doesn't run better on AMD's Z1 Extreme, I actually blame the developers in this case. It's just too hardware demanding for what it is, in my opinion. Next up is Fortnite with a very nice experience. 101 FPS on average at 1080p using low settings with XeSS on balanced with the 30W profile and 1% lows of 59 FPS. XeSS on balanced is providing a decent image here and helping pushing the FPS a bit for sure. I really wouldn't mind playing it like that all day long. Very occasional micro stutters, but nothing that really held me back, and it will probably even get smoother after a few more matches. And here even switching to the 17W profile still provided a decent experience, though the average FPS have been quite a bit lower with 69 FPS on average and 1% lows of now only 40. Though, again, if you want to play it on the go and get more out of that battery, the 17W profile is the way to go in this case. Forza Horizon 5 was working perfectly fine at 1080p and the medium preset with XeSS on quality using the 30W profile.
around 80 FPS on average with very high 1% lows of 69 FPS, meaning the gameplay felt extremely smooth. No hiccups or anything like that at all. Should be okay using the high preset here as well. Though at 17 watt I once more had severe issues. 52 FPS on average and 1% lows of 31 don't sound too bad, though I experienced severe rubber bending and constant heavy changes in the frame rate again, while the CPU and its 8 cores weren't even fully utilized. Not exactly stuttering, but unfortunately unplayable in this state, as that is just too disturbing. To be honest, I just wonder how that can happen in such a popular game on this device. And yes, I checked, it also happened when I played it on battery. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is pretty demanding hardware-wise, and I once more had to really crank down the settings. Using the 30 watt profile at 1080p with low settings and XeSS set to performance, I saw an average of 40 FPS and 1% lows of 23 running through the Vatican for a few minutes. It is definitely playable, though consider it's looking quite a bit blurry that way, though it's cool they just added XeSS instead of only having resolution scaling as an option as before. But that is on the other hand again fixed a bit when playing on the integrated 8-inch screen. And it actually remains somewhat playable with the 17 watt profile with an average of now 32 FPS and 1% lows of 18. Capping the FPS at 30 or further reducing the resolution would definitely make sense here. Though there have been some short phases with slight stuttering and drops to around 27 FPS in my benchmark run, but it was mostly at 30 FPS or above. The new Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is just optimized really well, and so I was using 1080p with medium settings and FSR on performance. 50 FPS on average and 1% lows of 39 gave me a very enjoyable experience, while I think the game looks good enough considering it's such a graphical intense game. I'm actually thinking about using this one for my extended battery test video, so make sure not to miss that one. And even with the 17 watt profile, it remained very playable with only little less FPS. Now it was 43 FPS on average and 1% lows of 34 FPS. Warhorse, if you see this, hats off to your team for delivering such a perfectly optimized game performance-wise. An absolute exception. Kudos. For Monster Hunter Wilds, we're just taking a quick look at the pre-released free benchmark run. 47 FPS on average using the 30 watt profile with low settings and activated frame generation, though the 1% lows have been horrible due to heavy stuttering on some occasions, and you probably wouldn't use frame generation at such low FPS anyhow. In this state, it's not recommendable playing the game on the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus in my opinion. And of course, things got worse with the 17 watt profile. Now I only saw 32 FPS despite frame generation and 1% lows of only 4. Not worth talking about any longer to be honest, so let's take a look at the next one instead. And that is PUBG. Using the 30 watt profile at 1080p with very low settings and the resolution scaling lowered to 80%, I achieved playable 76 FPS on average and 1% lows of 43. A few seldom micro-stutters here and there, but nothing game-breaking, all things considered. CPU usage was fine as well, though for some reason the GPU didn't boost as high as it should in this game, so maybe we'll have to wait for a fix to get a better performance. And at 17 watt we're still seeing 57 FPS on average with the same settings, while the 1% lows have been around 35 FPS. Still doable actually. And one thing I forgot, which just comes to my mind now that I'm editing this video, you could probably use higher texture settings in most of the games due to the big RAM capacity of the Claw 8 AI Plus. That should be working just fine in most cases. And like in similar of my previous videos, Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably one of the best looking games even on low-end hardware. I actually used the popular hardware unbox settings in combination with FSR on balanced. And that just looks so good, while it was really playable with 54 FPS on average in a 10-minute benchmark run, with 1% loss of 40 using the 30 watt profile. I didn't expect that really. Great experience and great visuals. Though, to some extent using the 17 watt profile, I once again experienced some rubber banding with a roller coaster-like frame time graph. Not all the time, but in some scenes and areas it was very noticeable, unfortunately. Didn't seem to be the CPU, as that wasn't fully utilized with some headroom left. Well, MSI, Intel, do your thing. The Witcher 3 next-gen version was absolutely playable on high settings with XeSS unbalanced using the 30 watt profile with an average of around 48 FPS and 1% loss of 38 after a 8-minute long benchmark run through Toussaint. Good visuals and a decent performance despite the badly optimized next-gen version. And even with the efficient 17 watt profile, the game ran stable with 41 FPS on average and 1% loss of 28, while the FPS never dropped below the mid-30s in my benchmark run. Definitely good enough for some fun on the go. And last but not least, the Wukong Black Myth benchmark tool, as I don't yet own the game myself. Using the 30 watt profile, I saw an average of 74 FPS with 1% loss of 63, with the settings set to low, FSR on 50% scaling and frame generation activated. It's not optimal for frame generation of course, but if you're not too picky about that, it might be fine I guess. And as mentioned before, only 46 FPS on average for the 17 watt profile when the Claw is plugged in, while unplugged the average FPS are actually in the 60s, so that's definitely a bug, probably more games affected.
So the MSI Claw is a big improvement performance-wise compared to its predecessor, and a lot of recent games actually run pretty fine, even though there are quite some games that need further driver optimization for sure. Lunar Lake is actually quite okay in my opinion, and I like that Intel managed to get the efficiency right at the 17 watt profile, though I really hope they fix that issue some games have concerning the CPU usage and the resulting bad frame times, since for some games that was perfectly fine. Now this is not a review since I'm only focusing on the performance here, but in general they kinda learned from their mistakes with the first one. I also really like the 32GB of RAM, since that should be enough for another 5 years or so, and it makes it much more usable as a PC replacement as well, especially combined with the now 2 USB-C 4 ports it has. And I personally like the bigger 8-inch screen with VRR, the big battery and the fact that they fixed the basically unusable mushy shoulder buttons from the last generation this time. But it's definitely too expensive at the 1,000 euros or dollar price point that I paid for it. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be $200 to $400 less in like 6 or 12 months. And that's all for today. Make sure to stick around for an extended battery test I'm planning with the MSI Claw in the future. Don't forget to like and or subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.